What if the one thing Prince Harry feared more than public criticism wasn't criticism at all? What if it was exposure? Not exposure in the tabloid sense, not gossip, not online noise, but something deeper, something structural, something that, once questioned, can never be unquestioned again. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a headline. It begins with silence. A silence that, according to commentators and royal observers, has grown louder with every passing week. A silence that now feels deliberate, heavy, almost rehearsed. And when silence appears in a family that has never hesitated to speak, people notice. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw Prince Harry look genuinely relaxed when his children were mentioned? Not performative joy, not polished interviews, but ease. Some say that unease may finally have a reason. Because according to explosive commentary circulating in royal media circles, author Tom Bower is once again circling a story that many believed was untouchable. A story involving timelines, hospital sightings, and a child whose very existence has become a lightning rod for speculation. And now, allegedly, Harry is panicking. That word keeps coming up. Panicking. Not angry. Not defiant. Panicked. Why would a prince? A man who walked away from the monarchy, sued tabloids, and publicly confronted his own family. Be afraid now? That's the question that refuses to go away. And the answer, if critics are to be believed, may lie with one name. Lilibet. Let's be very clear from the start. No one is questioning the child herself. No one is questioning her innocence. And no one is denying her place as a daughter loved by her parents. What is being questioned, according to commentators, is something else entirely. The narrative, the timeline, the secrecy, and the sudden emergence of alleged new information that some say was never meant to surface. This is not just another royal controversy. This is a story about control, about who gets to define truth, and about what happens when investigative scrutiny collides with a carefully constructed public image. Because when Tom Bower enters the conversation, history tells us one thing. He doesn't speculate loudly. He documents quietly. And when his work lands, it tends to land hard. So why is his name suddenly being linked to Lilibet? Why now? And why, according to multiple royal watchers, does Prince Harry appear increasingly tense whenever this subject is raised? To understand why this story matters, you have to understand timing. The royal family is no stranger to scandal, but scandals usually follow a pattern. Rumor, leak, response, damage control. This one doesn't. This one lingers. It surfaces, disappears, resurfaces again, each time with more detail, more confidence, and fewer denials. And here's where things get uncomfortable. If the allegations were baseless, wouldn't they have been shut down immediately? If there were nothing to question, wouldn't clarity be the easiest solution? Yet clarity never comes. Instead, there are statements about privacy, about boundaries, about protecting children. All understandable, all reasonable, and yet incomplete. Because privacy is one thing, opacity is another, and the difference between the two is intent. That's where the story turns. Because according to commentary gaining traction online and in alternative media, what's emerging now isn't a single claim, it's a pattern of delayed announcements, a pattern of tightly controlled images, a pattern of language that seems carefully chosen to avoid specifics. And patterns make people curious. Curiosity leads to investigation. And investigation leads to questions that refuse to stay quiet, especially when photos allegedly surface. Photos that, according to those discussing them, were never meant for public eyes. Hospital corridors, private rooms, familiar faces, and unfamiliar ones. And at the center of those images, according to the narrative circulating, is a question that the Sussexes have never publicly addressed head-on. Was a surrogate involved? Now let's pause. Surrogacy itself is not scandalous. Thousands of families rely on it, celebrities included. But within the context of royal lineage, titles, and public representation, it becomes legally, culturally, and symbolically complex. And complexity is where trouble begins. Because once a question like that is asked, it doesn't disappear. It multiplies. Why was the birth announcement handled differently than Archie's? Why were details sparse? Why were protocols seemingly altered? Why did official confirmations feel restrained? These are the questions that fuel speculation, not malicious intent. And speculation, when ignored, hardens. Now add Tom Bauer to that equation, an author known not for whispers, but for receipts. A man whose previous works left powerful people scrambling. If he is indeed investigating, as commentators suggest, then the stakes escalate immediately. Because Bauer doesn't chase rumors. He follows trails, and trails lead to documents, witnesses, timelines. That's why, according to those watching closely, Prince Harry's demeanor matters so much. Observers point to recent appearances, the clipped answers, the visible discomfort, the way his tone shifts when his children are mentioned. Is it stress, fatigue, or something else? Ask yourself, if you had nothing to hide, would you look worried, or would you look bored? That's the question fueling endless debate. And now, reportedly, the debate has entered a new phase. Because it's no longer just online commentators asking questions. It's journalists. It's insiders. It's people who understand how royal systems work and how deviations stand out. And that's why this moment feels different. Heavier. More consequential. This isn't about reputation anymore. It's about legitimacy, narrative control, and the long-term implications for a child whose name carries enormous symbolic weight. Lilibet, named after a queen, connected to history. And now, unfairly or not, entangled in controversy she never chose. That's the tragedy at the heart of this story. A child at the center of adult decisions, adult secrecy, adult consequences. And if even a fraction of the allegations are true, then the reason for Harry's alleged panic becomes clearer. Because panic doesn't come from criticism. It comes from loss of control, from the realization that once questions escape into the public sphere, they cannot be retrieved. You can only respond or remain silent. And silence, as history shows, is rarely neutral. So why hasn't there been a definitive statement? Why hasn't the narrative been closed? Why does every attempt to move forward seem to reopen the same wound? Some say it's strategy. Others say it's fear. And others say it's because the truth, whatever it is, doesn't fit neatly into the story that was already told. That's what makes this story so explosive. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. And because of who may soon decide to speak. Because if Tom Bauer really is preparing to reveal what commentators claim he has uncovered, then this conversation is about to change dramatically. And if that happens, Harry's fear may no longer be about speculation. It may be about confirmation. But what exactly has allegedly been discovered? Why do hospital sightings matter so much? And who is the woman that appears in the leaked photos that no one can quite explain? Because according to those following this story closely, the next revelation doesn't just raise eyebrows. It changes the entire timeline. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When Tom Bauer speaks, the world listens. But not in the way tabloids do. Not with flashing cameras and sound bites. No, Bauer's words carry weight because they are measured, documented, and relentlessly sourced. Every allegation, every claim, every tiny inconsistency he highlights is backed by something solid, whether a record, a testimony, or a document most people don't even know exists. And when he enters a story, especially one involving the Sussexes, it's rarely subtle. It's rarely simple. It is seismic. So, why is Tom Bauer allegedly circling Lilibet's story now? That's the question buzzing across royal media circles, whispered in podcasts, and dissected in articles that try, and fail, to remain impartial. According to commentary, Bauer has a long history of pursuing what insiders call the hidden truths of the British monarchy. He has a reputation for pulling together seemingly unrelated threads, for connecting dates, statements, and appearances in ways that leave no room for convenient explanations. Some might call it obsessive. Others call it meticulous journalism. The result? When he publishes, those in power sit up and take notice. And now, it seems, the focus has shifted. Lilibet, the youngest member of the Sussex family, a child who, until recently, was shielded from almost every public gaze. A child whose very existence is tied to secrets, real or alleged, that some say Harry and Meghan have gone to great lengths to protect. And yet, Bauer's name has surfaced in connection with details that could, if true, rewrite the narrative the Sussexes have carefully curated. But let's pause here. It's important to remember something about Bauer. He does not chase sensationalism for its own sake. He does not seek to create drama. He seeks evidence, patterns, and, above all, accountability. That's what makes the alleged connection between him and Lilibet so striking. Because this is not a story of mere curiosity. This is a story that challenges the foundation of a narrative long presented to the public. Commentators argue that Bauer's methodology is why Harry reportedly panicked. While the world sees a prince who has stepped back from royal duties, the reality behind closed doors might be very different. Imagine the stress of knowing that every public appearance, every interview, every carefully timed statement could be scrutinized, dissected, and challenged by a writer with an almost unparalleled track record for uncovering inconvenient truths. Imagine the sleepless nights, the whispered meetings, the frantic legal consultations. According to sources, that is exactly the environment surrounding Harry as Bauer allegedly intensifies his scrutiny. So what is Bauer allegedly investigating? It's difficult to say with certainty because, naturally, there are layers. Observers suggest it revolves around timelines, the when and how of Lilibet's birth, her hospital appearances, and the sequence of public announcements. These may seem like mundane details, but in the world of royalty, they carry enormous weight. Timing is everything. Dates matter, protocol matters, and discrepancies, however small, can ignite enormous speculation. Some say that Bauer's recent research highlights inconsistencies that even the most casual observer might notice if they are looking closely enough. And then there's the pattern. Patterns are Bauer's specialty. In past investigations, he has meticulously traced the movement of people, the timing of statements, and the subtle shifts in public relations strategies. That's why commentators argue that what he allegedly found regarding Lilibet may not just be a single anomaly, but a series of them, a trail that, if followed, could illuminate a larger, more complex picture. A picture that, some argue, Harry and Meghan have worked tirelessly to manage, obscure, or control. Consider the reactions. Insiders report that whenever questions about Lilibet are raised in interviews or public appearances, Harry's responses are measured, precise, almost rehearsed. Some interpret this as composure. Others see it as stress. But when viewed in the context of an investigation like Bauer's, the latter seems plausible. After all, no amount of public charm can erase the discomfort of knowing someone is quietly connecting dots behind the scenes. And commentators suggest that panic, subtle, private, and concealed, may be the real story, even if it is never broadcast to the world. It's also worth noting that Bauer's alleged involvement carries symbolic weight. He is not just any author. He is a writer who has taken on institutions, power structures, and individuals who believe themselves untouchable. He has made a career of uncovering inconvenient truths that many hoped would remain hidden. That alone adds an extra layer of tension to the Sussex narrative. Because when someone of Bauer's caliber enters the conversation, the usual strategies of avoidance and deflection may no longer suffice. In other words, if Bauer is indeed examining this story, the stakes are immediately higher. What makes this more compelling and alarming, depending on your perspective, is that Bauer reportedly does not rely solely on speculation or gossip. He triangulates information. He examines public statements, timing of media appearances, and discrepancies in coverage. He reviews legal documents, personal statements, and background research. In short, he leaves very little to chance. And that, according to those close to the story, is precisely why Harry's alleged anxiety has escalated. There's no room for simple denials when the investigator is methodical, thorough, and relentless. Of course, not everything attributed to Bauer is confirmed. Some commentators caution against taking every rumor at face value. But in the world of investigative royal journalism, the mere suggestion of Bauer's attention can be enough to shift behavior, influence public perception, and, according to insiders, provoke the kind of behind-the-scenes panic reportedly being seen in Sussex circles. And then there's the timing. Timing is everything. Why now? Why would Bauer allegedly turn his focus toward Lilibet at this moment? Observers suggest that a combination of factors might be at play. The recent media interest in hospital sightings, alleged leaked photos, and the enduring public fascination with the Sussexes' private lives. All of these elements create a perfect storm, and Bauer is, by reputation, a storm chaser of the most meticulous kind. The alleged panic isn't just about potential exposure. It's about narrative control. It's about the risk that once patterns and timelines are publicly scrutinized, there is no going back. Silence is no longer an option. Carefully crafted public relations strategies may suddenly seem inadequate, and private anxieties may become public controversies. For someone who has invested so heavily in controlling both narrative and public perception, that is precisely the kind of pressure that leads to what insiders describe as panic. But here's the critical question. If Bauer's alleged investigation is accurate, and if the patterns he reportedly identified are correct, what does that mean for Lilibet, for Harry, for Meghan, and for the story the public has been told? That is the tension that drives every discussion, every analysis, and every whispered theory about this story. Because when someone of Bauer's investigative rigor enters a family's narrative, the consequences extend beyond reputations. They extend into the realm of history, legacy, and perception, and, some argue, even influence the personal, emotional lives of those involved. So what can we expect next? That's the million-dollar question. Some speculate that a book, an exposé, or a carefully timed media release could be coming. Others suggest that Harry and Meghan will attempt to preemptively shape the narrative with their own controlled disclosures. And yet, no matter the approach, insiders argue that Bauer's involvement changes the game entirely. Because when he enters a story, the rules of engagement are no longer dictated by public relations teams, legal advisors, or even the individuals themselves. They are dictated by facts, timelines, and evidence, the kind of evidence that cannot be easily ignored. And while the public debates what this means, Lilibet remains at the center of the storm. In the eyes of commentators, the child is emblematic of the tension between privacy and public scrutiny, secrecy and exposure, protection and control. That dichotomy is at the heart of why Bauer's alleged involvement is so significant. It's not just about uncovering information. It's about revealing how a story has been managed, curated, and presented, and what gaps or inconsistencies exist beneath the surface. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Some dates don't argue. They whisper. And when you pay close attention, the whispers become a story all their own. For most of the public, the announcement of Lilibet's birth was a moment of joy. Another royal child, another family milestone. Headlines framed it as a celebration. Sussex joy, read one. A new princess, read another. And for a moment, the world shared in a narrative carefully curated to reassure, delight, and distract. But according to commentators who study royal media strategy and timelines, something about this particular birth never quite sat right. It starts with the announcement itself. Official statements, carefully phrased, appeared at specific times. Exact wording mattered. But the phrasing, observers suggest, was unusually sparse. "We are delighted to announce" is standard. "Born via surrogate" would never appear publicly, even if true. And the absence of detail, when combined with subtle timing cues, delays in photos, the spacing between hospital reports and public confirmations, created a gap. A gap that, to someone like Tom Bauer, is never insignificant. Consider this. In a world of instant social media, where news travels in milliseconds, why would information about a royal child take days to settle into public consciousness? Why would carefully managed photographs appear selectively? Why would some media outlets report different versions of the timing? Every discrepancy, however minor, becomes a piece of a puzzle that refuses to fit neatly. And this is precisely the point. In normal circumstances, minor inconsistencies are irrelevant. But in the royal context, where every public appearance, every photograph, every press release is curated, even a small deviation is amplified. And commentators suggest that these deviations were noticed. First by journalists, then by insiders, and finally, allegedly, by Tom Bauer himself. There are reported gaps between when Harry and Meghan were allegedly at the hospital, when staff and witnesses supposedly saw them, and when images of the newborn appeared in public or were reported by press agencies. Some timelines indicate days of silence, unusual given the press attention around any royal birth. Other timelines suggest overlaps. Times when Harry or Meghan were reported to be elsewhere, yet photographed or observed in hospital corridors. The result? A tension that grew louder with every day the story remained unclarified. For commentators, this was never just about convenience. It was about perception. It was about control. It was about the narrative the Sussexes wanted the public to consume, and the narrative that, for some reason, kept showing signs of strain. Then there is the curious case of pre-birth speculation. Weeks before the birth, outlets and commentators debated possible names, timing, and circumstances. The public discussion created expectations, timelines imagined in the collective consciousness. When the real events did not match these imagined timelines, it created a subtle cognitive dissonance. People sensed a discrepancy even if they could not articulate it. And that's exactly the kind of tension that can keep investigators awake. Bauer's alleged approach, as commentators describe, is to map every reported time, every press statement, every observed movement, and then look for inconsistencies. A mismatch of hours or days may seem trivial to the casual observer, but in this context, it becomes significant. There's also the matter of hospital sightings. According to commentary, Harry and Meghan were allegedly observed entering or leaving medical facilities at times that did not match publicly released information. These discrepancies raise questions not just about scheduling, but about the circumstances surrounding the birth itself. Was it conventional? Was it via surrogate? Was there a reason for selective visibility? Each question, left unanswered, adds another layer of intrigue. It's worth noting that these questions are not accusations. They are observations, analysis, and speculation, the kind that drives investigative journalists like Bauer. Observers emphasize that even small timeline inconsistencies, when compounded, can point to larger narratives. And the public, hungry for clarity, often fills these gaps with assumptions, some reasonable, some wild. Then there is the human element. Consider the psychological pressure on Harry and Meghan. For a couple constantly under scrutiny, where every action is analyzed, a child's birth is not a private event. It is a public spectacle, a media event, a narrative opportunity. And, if handled imperfectly, a potential source of criticism. According to insiders, the weight of this scrutiny, combined with the subtle gaps in timing and reporting, contributes to stress. And some commentators suggest that this stress, if unaddressed, can manifest as panic, the kind of panic reportedly observed in Harry in private settings. The timing also intersects with other controversies and media narratives. The public's attention, even before Lilibet's birth, had been saturated with stories about the Sussexes' media deals, their move to the U.S., and previous allegations of secrecy. The addition of subtle timeline inconsistencies creates a compounding effect. Each small anomaly does not exist in isolation. It is magnified by the surrounding context. Analysts argue that this is precisely why Bauer's alleged involvement is so critical. By mapping the timeline meticulously, cross-referencing sightings, announcements, and public appearances, he reportedly constructs a narrative independent of PR control. The result is a chronology that may, intentionally or not, highlight inconsistencies or raise questions previously unseen by the general public. It's also important to recognize the emotional undercurrent. Every detail matters, not just for public perception, but for family dynamics. Some commentators note that inconsistencies in public narratives can strain internal trust, fuel rumors among acquaintances, and generate tension within a family already navigating intense scrutiny. The juxtaposition of public control versus private reality creates fertile ground for stress and anxiety, particularly for those at the center of the story. And yet, despite all the speculation, the birth timeline remains partially opaque. The deliberate spacing of announcements, the selective release of photographs, and the timing of media coverage all contribute to an air of mystery. It's as if the story is designed to reveal enough to satisfy curiosity, but not enough to quell it. Observers note that this delicate balance between disclosure and concealment can keep audiences engaged, but also leaves open the possibility of new revelations at any moment. Which brings us back to the role of investigators like Bauer. By focusing on these timeline gaps, he reportedly uncovers not just anomalies, but patterns, subtle shifts in how information is released, the sequencing of appearances, and the consistency of statements. These patterns, commentators suggest, may ultimately reveal deeper truths about strategy, control, and intention. And that's where tension meets speculation. Because when timelines don't align neatly, questions arise. Why was there a delay? Why were certain details omitted? Why did the sequence of announcements differ from expectations set by prior births? Each question is a spark, and when combined with alleged photographic evidence and insider commentary, it becomes a flame. For Harry, the alleged impact is clear. Observers suggest that the cumulative weight of scrutiny, combined with ongoing media attention and the prospect of investigative exposure, may have contributed to a heightened state of anxiety. Panic, some sources allege, does not manifest publicly in grand gestures. It manifests in subtle cues, clipped responses, rehearsed smiles, avoidance of specific topics, and heightened sensitivity to questions about family or timelines. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this timeline discussion is the public's perception versus reality. For the casual observer, everything seems normal. A royal baby is born, a family shares photographs, headlines celebrate the arrival. Yet beneath this surface, commentators argue, a complex web of timing, control, and selective visibility exists, a web that, if traced carefully, tells a story different from the one presented. And that, in turn, fuels both speculation and panic. Because once inconsistencies are mapped, once patterns are identified, once questions are asked, the narrative is no longer entirely under control. And as every PR strategist knows, losing control of a narrative, particularly one as high-profile as a royal birth, can have consequences far beyond public perception. So what does this mean for the Sussexes? It means that, according to insiders, every move must be measured. Every statement, appearance, and photograph must be considered not just for immediate impact, but for its place in a broader timeline that the public, investigators, and media may be tracing simultaneously. It means that the act of parenting, even in private, is entangled with perception, timing, and scrutiny. And it may explain why commentators claim that Harry's reaction to the situation has been, at times, less composed than the public might expect. Ultimately, the birth timeline is more than dates and announcements. It is a reflection of control, strategy, and narrative management. And when gaps, inconsistencies, or anomalies exist, they are not trivial. They are signals. They are prompts for inquiry. They are potential triggers for exposure. And that is precisely what makes this chapter of the story of when Lilibet arrived and how it was revealed, so compelling, so tense, and so consequential. But what came next would push these questions beyond speculation, moving from timing and announcements into the realm of visual evidence, photos that some say were never meant to be seen by the public. And those images, observers allege, would ignite a controversy unlike any the Sussexes had faced before. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. But some pictures are worth 1,000 questions. And according to commentators and insiders tracking the Sussexes, the images of Harry, Meghan, and the newborn allegedly seen in hospital corridors are exactly that, question-generating images. They weren't paparazzi shots in the traditional sense. They weren't staged publicity photographs meant to generate goodwill or media buzz. No, these were snapshots, leaked, allegedly accidental, and undeniably provocative, that hint at a story the public wasn't meant to see. Imagine the scene, a quiet hospital wing, nurses moving swiftly between rooms, security personnel monitoring access, and, somewhere in the mix, cameras capturing fleeting moments. A father holding his newborn, a mother resting, a family framed against the antiseptic, fluorescent-lit corridors. On the surface, it's a familiar scene. But when you look closer, according to reports, inconsistencies jump out. Timing, access, placement, who else is present, what's in the background, and most of all, the timing relative to public announcements. Commentators point out that these photos were not released through official channels. They weren't tweeted by official social media accounts. They weren't part of a scheduled photo op designed to convey carefully controlled emotions. Instead, they appeared in obscure corners of the internet, referenced in articles, and circulated quietly among commentators. That alone is enough to spark curiosity. When something leaks outside the expected channels, it immediately gains significance. And when it involves someone as scrutinized as Harry, it becomes explosive. The first thing observers note is the appearance of the parents. Harry's posture, Meghan's demeanor, small cues, subtle gestures, the way they interact with staff and security. For those accustomed to reading body language, These images suggest tension beneath the surface. Not discomfort with the child, never that, but discomfort with observation itself. The kind of tension that emerges when you are aware you are being watched, but cannot control who is watching or what they see. Then there is the question of who else appears in these images. Allegedly, there are figures who are neither hospital staff nor family friends, individuals whose presence has sparked speculation. Some commentators suggest that these may be legal representatives, advisors, or private security. Others speculate about witnesses to the alleged surrogacy process. None of this is confirmed. But the mere suggestion of unknown observers adds layers of intrigue and raises the stakes for the Sussex narrative. Another detail analysts highlight is timing. The images, according to commentary, appear to show the family in the hospital at times that do not align precisely with publicly reported arrivals or departures. Some frames suggest the newborn is already in Harry's arms before official announcements of birth. Other frames reportedly show Meghan resting or leaving the hospital before images were supposedly taken. These discrepancies may seem minor, but in the context of tightly controlled royal announcements, they are significant. Consider the psychological effect. For the public, the images may seem mundane, just another glimpse into the life of a celebrity couple. But for Harry and Meghan, and for observers like Bauer, the implications are deeper. Every photograph is a record. Every record is evidence of timing, behavior, and circumstance. And evidence, once in the public domain, cannot be retracted. Even if blurred, even if circulated privately, it becomes part of a digital footprint that can be examined, analyzed, and interpreted indefinitely. There's also the matter of narrative. Up until these alleged images surfaced, the public narrative about Lilibet's birth was curated. Sparse announcements, carefully chosen words, selected photographs. All designed to project privacy, control, and calm. And suddenly, these images challenged that narrative. They raised questions about what the public had not been told, about what remained unseen. They suggested that there was more happening behind the hospital doors than the public had been led to believe. Some commentators point to subtle visual cues in the images. The positioning of hands. The sequence of interactions between staff and parents. The presence of items not officially accounted for in public reports. Each element, while seemingly insignificant alone, forms part of a pattern that cannot be ignored. And patterns are what investigative reporters like Bauer notice first. Patterns lead to questions. Questions lead to investigation. Investigation leads to narrative disruption. And disruption, according to insiders, is exactly what is feared. Because the Sussexes have built a brand. One centered on privacy, agency, and control over their public image. When images like these leak, the balance is upset. Suddenly, the control is not entirely in their hands. Suddenly, there are visual witnesses to events that were previously invisible. And for a family under such intense scrutiny, losing control, even momentarily, can trigger panic, strategic missteps, or defensive maneuvers. There's also an emotional layer to consider. These images, despite the speculation, show intimacy. A father holding a newborn, a mother resting after childbirth, tender moments. And yet, the very intimacy captured is what makes the images explosive. Because it's not just a personal moment. It's a moment framed within the context of timing, access, and public perception. And when intimacy intersects with scrutiny, tension multiplies. Analysts also note the role of selective visibility. While some photographs may have surfaced, others remain unseen, circulating quietly or referenced only in commentary. This selective exposure creates a dynamic where the public is teased with fragments, but never given the complete picture. The result is endless speculation, a heightened sense of curiosity, and, according to commentators, mounting pressure on Harry and Meghan to respond, directly or indirectly. The impact of these images extends beyond immediate perception. They feed into broader narratives about secrecy, narrative control, and the management of personal versus public life. Observers argue that in the digital age, where images can circulate globally in minutes, even a single photograph can have long-term implications. Once patterns of behavior, timing, or presence are documented visually, they become difficult to contextualize, reinterpret, or dismiss. And while the public may debate the meaning of these images, insiders suggest that the effect on Harry has been tangible. Panic, some sources allege, is not a theatrical display. It is a series of small, internalized reactions, heightened vigilance, anxiety about appearances, and concern over the potential for misinterpretation. When combined with the attention of investigative reporters like Bauer, the alleged pressure becomes magnified. Finally, there is the question of motive. Why would such images emerge? According to commentary, it could be accidental, the result of leaks, or the inevitable byproduct of being constantly observed. Alternatively, it could be strategic, a controlled release intended to shape narrative subtly without formal announcement. Whatever the case, the effect is undeniable. They complicate an already delicate story, amplify curiosity, and, crucially, create pressure that commentators argue is causing Harry to feel cornered. In short, these hospital photos, whether intentional or accidental, form a visual record that challenges the narrative carefully constructed by the Sussexes. They raise questions about timing, access, presence, and privacy. They provide investigators like Bauer with data points to analyze, corroborate, and cross-reference. And they generate a kind of tension that words alone cannot convey. The tension of being watched, of being scrutinized, and of potentially losing control over one's own story. And that is why, according to those following the saga, these images are not just photos. They are a catalyst, a spark, a subtle, silent signal that the story the public has been told may be incomplete, and that the next revelations could shift everything. But what came next would take speculation from photographs into uncharted territory, the whispered question of surrogacy. A topic never officially addressed, yet one that commentators claim could be the key to understanding why the timeline, the images, and the narrative have been so tightly controlled. One word, never confirmed, never denied. And yet, it hovers over the story like a shadow, surrogacy. It's a topic the Sussexes have never publicly addressed in relation to Lilibet. And in royal circles, the absence of a statement is not neutral. It is a void. A gap in the narrative that commentators, journalists, and investigative authors like Tom Bauer allegedly notice immediately. Silence, after all, is a language of its own. And when silence coincides with timing inconsistencies and leaked photographs, it becomes a story waiting to be told, whether anyone wants it told or not. Let's be clear. Surrogacy is not scandalous. In today's world, countless families, including public figures and celebrities, rely on it to build their families. It is legal, legitimate, and deeply personal. But when you combine surrogacy with a family like the Sussexes, people constantly scrutinized, a child with a name tied to royal history, and timing and announcements under intense observation, suddenly the stakes are elevated. Questions arise. Speculation escalates. And for a father like Harry, already navigating immense public scrutiny, those questions are potentially explosive. Analysts argue that the way surrogacy is discussed, or rather, avoided, in this context is telling. Consider the careful language used in announcements. Phrases like, "the family is delighted," or "we ask for privacy," are deliberately broad. They avoid specifics about the birth method. Observers suggest that this may be intentional, not to deceive, but to protect a child's privacy while controlling public perception. Yet in the absence of confirmation, curiosity fills the void. And curiosity, as every public relations strategist knows, cannot be easily contained. This is where the alleged investigation into Lilibet's birth intersects with surrogacy speculation. According to commentators, Bauer is interested not in sensational claims, but in patterns and documentation. Hospital visits, timing, the presence of particular individuals, and sequence of announcements are all potentially relevant to understanding whether a surrogate may have been involved. In other words, the question is not merely about method. It's about tracing events, timelines, and evidence to construct a coherent narrative. The implications of surrogacy, if confirmed or even strongly suggested, are significant. In the world of royalty, lineage and public perception carry symbolic weight. A child's method of birth may influence public opinion, media narratives, and, some argue, perceptions of authenticity or legitimacy, even if, legally, there is no difference. That tension, commentators note, is precisely why the question is so loaded, and why Harry's alleged anxiety may spike whenever the topic surfaces, even indirectly. Consider also the emotional stakes. Parenthood is inherently private, and yet, for the Sussexes, privacy is nearly impossible to maintain. Every appearance, every photograph, every casual mention of family life is observed, analyzed, and dissected. If surrogacy is part of the story, the couple faces the dual challenge of protecting their child's privacy while managing public curiosity that is relentless, invasive, and sometimes accusatory. The result is an environment where even the smallest questions can trigger disproportionate stress. Another layer to consider is the media strategy. Analysts note that controlling information about surrogacy is not just about privacy, it is about narrative framing. By avoiding confirmation, the Sussexes maintain flexibility. They are not locked into a particular storyline, and they can respond selectively if and when the public or investigators probe further. Yet, paradoxically, this very strategy also fuels speculation. Because the more information is withheld, the more eager commentators, journalists, and the public become to connect dots, interpret photographs, and analyze timelines. Observers also highlight the interplay between surrogacy speculation and hospital sightings. Alleged photographs, taken at times inconsistent with public announcements, feed directly into the surrogacy question. Were these images capturing a surrogate handing over the child? Were they capturing moments intended to establish a controlled public narrative? Or were they simply incidental glimpses of private family life? The ambiguity creates tension, and tension, according to insiders, is exactly what Harry reportedly fears. Then there is the legal dimension. Surrogacy laws vary by jurisdiction. In some places, the process involves multiple legal agreements, medical procedures, and regulatory oversight. Public disclosure of surrogacy can have legal and logistical consequences, particularly when cross-border arrangements are involved. Even indirect acknowledgement in the press could prompt inquiries or documentation requests, adding another layer of stress for parents who are already navigating a public relations minefield. Commentators emphasize the psychological impact on the parents. Imagine holding a newborn while being conscious that every movement, every facial expression, every interaction is potentially observed, analyzed, and published, and that the narrative surrounding your child's birth is already contested. The result, insiders suggest, is hypervigilance, a need to control every detail. And in high-pressure moments, panic, or at least heightened anxiety, is not just plausible, it's almost inevitable. At the same time, surrogacy adds moral and ethical complexity to the story. The public tends to judge visibility, secrecy, and perceived intentions differently, depending on the method of birth. Commentators suggest that even the mere possibility of surrogacy invites scrutiny. Why was the announcement handled this way? Why were hospital sightings selective? Why does timing appear inconsistent? Each unanswered question fuels speculation, and speculation, once it gathers momentum, is difficult to redirect. And yet, amid the uncertainty, there is tenderness. Observers note that whether Lilibet was born via surrogate or conventionally, the images, interactions, and statements consistently convey care, love, and commitment. The child is at the center, not controversy. But the tension arises because secrecy, even when protective, is interpreted differently in a world that demands transparency. The private reality of parenthood collides with public expectation, creating friction that commentators say is felt acutely by Harry. This brings us to the core of the alleged panic, the intersection of privacy, perception, and exposure. If surrogacy is part of the narrative, then every photograph, every timeline discrepancy, every selective statement gains additional significance. The child's method of arrival becomes more than a personal matter. It becomes a focal point for media scrutiny, public debate, and investigative inquiry. For parents constantly under observation, that level of scrutiny is not just stressful, it is overwhelming. And that is why, according to those following this story, the surrogacy question has never been publicly addressed. Not to deceive, not to provoke, but to protect a child while attempting to maintain a semblance of narrative control. But the paradox, commentators note, is that the act of avoiding the question has made it even more central to public attention. Silence has amplified curiosity. Ambiguity has fueled speculation. And for a family navigating both public and private pressures, the consequences are inescapable. Finally, the surrogacy question is a narrative hinge. It connects timelines, hospital sightings, and selective photographic evidence into a coherent frame, or at least a frame that investigators can analyze. And analysts argue that once you connect these elements, the tension is almost tangible. A couple trying to protect a child while managing public scrutiny, an investigative author allegedly mapping every detail, and a world watching every move. But just when it seems the story cannot become more complicated, there is a detail that changes everything: an alleged connection between Harry's private statements and Bauer's emerging findings. A connection that some insiders suggest could explain the panic, the timing, and the selective visibility. And that brings us to the next chapter, where Harry's own words, long analyzed, are re-examined under a new light, revealing tensions and contradictions that no one expected. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, in old interviews, casual remarks, or offhand comments that seemed inconsequential at the time. But when examined closely, patterns emerge and contradictions, subtle yet telling, reveal themselves. For Prince Harry, whose life has been dissected in unprecedented detail, even a single statement can take on new meaning when placed alongside timelines, photographs, and allegations of secrecy. And according to commentators, that is exactly what makes this chapter of the story so compelling. It starts with interviews. Over the years, Harry has spoken about his family, his children, and the pressures of royal life with a rare mixture of candor and restraint. Observers note that his tone varies dramatically depending on context. At times, he is playful, even self-deprecating. At other moments, he is measured, almost defensive. And in the specific context of discussing his children, commentators suggest a noticeable shift. A tension beneath the words, a careful selection of phrasing, and a subtle avoidance of details that might otherwise satisfy public curiosity. Consider his remarks about parenthood. Harry has often emphasized the desire to protect his children from media scrutiny. "We want to give them a normal life," he once said, words repeated countless times in news outlets. On the surface, this is a simple statement of intent. But when re-examined alongside the timing of Lilibet's birth, the selective release of photographs, and the alleged hospital sightings, the statement takes on a new dimension. It becomes a kind of foreshadowing, an acknowledgement that controlling information is not just desirable, but necessary, and that failing to do so could have real consequences. Then there are his comments about the media. Harry has been vocal about the pressures imposed by press intrusion, the stress of constant scrutiny, and the impact on mental health. In interviews, he often emphasizes accountability, fairness, and responsibility. But commentators point out contradictions. On one hand, he speaks of protecting privacy. On the other, he participates in high-profile media projects, interviews, and appearances that inevitably invite public attention. This duality, commentators argue, may contribute to internal tension and a heightened sensitivity to leaks, rumors, and unexpected exposure, including those hospital images that allegedly sparked panic. The language he uses is also telling. Phrases like, "we need to be careful," or "it's not as simple as it looks," are frequently highlighted by analysts. Taken individually, these remarks seem innocuous. Taken collectively, they suggest an awareness of narrative complexity, a recognition that controlling perception is not straightforward, and a tacit acknowledgement that discrepancies, even minor ones, can escalate if left unaddressed. Observers also scrutinize his tone and cadence. Stress, discomfort, or anxiety often manifests not just in what is said, but how it is said. Clipped sentences, pauses before answering, and shifts in vocal inflection all indicate a heightened state of awareness. When these cues are combined with the context of Lilibet's birth and the surrounding timeline anomalies, commentators suggest that they reveal more than words alone could convey. A man under pressure, navigating the impossible intersection of family, legacy, and public perception. One particularly interesting element is the juxtaposition of past statements against current events. Harry has repeatedly emphasized the importance of protecting children's mental health, shielding them from public scrutiny, and controlling the narrative of their upbringing. Yet, the selective release of photographs, the carefully timed announcements, and the alleged hospital sightings create tension with these stated principles. The result is a landscape of subtle contradictions that investigative observers like Bauer reportedly find compelling. Then there are the interviews where he discusses decision-making. Harry has often framed choices in terms of safety, security, and emotional well-being. "Every decision we make is for their protection," he said in one interview, a line widely cited. Yet, commentators highlight that timing inconsistencies and photographic leaks may suggest that narrative control, despite best intentions, has not been absolute. In other words, the desire to protect is clear, but the execution is imperfect. And imperfection, in the eyes of investigators and the public alike, invites scrutiny. Another layer comes from body language observed during interviews. Analysts note subtle micro-expressions, fleeting moments of tension, eyes shifting, hands fidgeting, or a pause that seems out of place. These nonverbal cues, when combined with statements, create a fuller picture. Observers suggest that they reveal awareness of external pressures, the weight of public expectation, and the personal stakes involved in maintaining narrative control over the family story, particularly concerning Lilibet. Harry's words also contain foreshadowing. Statements about lessons learned, caution with the press, and awareness of historical patterns within the royal family hint at an understanding that missteps can have cascading consequences. Commentators argue that this foreshadowing is especially relevant when considering the alleged panics surrounding the timing, hospital images, and surrogacy speculation. In other words, Harry may have anticipated challenges before they even arose, yet still found himself navigating unforeseen pressures once they materialized. Consider, too, the emotional undertones. Analysts highlight moments where Harry's statements about family happiness, protection, or public pressure are punctuated by sighs, hesitations, or shifts in expression. These cues, minor though they may seem, are interpreted as signs of concern, anticipation, or anxiety, the kind of emotional spikes that occur when someone is acutely aware of hidden variables and potential exposure. And in the context of investigative scrutiny, even small emotional signals take on amplified significance. There's also the matter of consistency. Observers repeatedly point out contradictions between statements made in formal interviews versus more casual remarks in documentaries or private settings. On one hand, Harry emphasizes transparency and honesty. On the other, he avoids details that could clarify timelines or methods of birth. This inconsistency, commentators argue, is not necessarily intentional deceit, but is interpreted by investigative analysts as evidence of tension, caution, and strategic communication. The most compelling aspect, according to insiders, is the interplay between Harry's words and the emerging external evidence, photographs, timelines, and commentary from investigative authors like Bauer. Each statement, past or present, is reevaluated in light of alleged new findings. Remarks that once seemed benign suddenly acquire weight. Phrases about privacy become loaded with subtext. Mentions of timing become hints at potential narrative manipulation, and moments intended as reassurance are reframed as cautious deflection. This re-examination also extends to public statements regarding Meghan and family life. Harry's expressions of partnership, support, and unity are scrutinized alongside timing anomalies and selective disclosures. Observers argue that the combination of visual, temporal, and verbal evidence creates a tension that may not have been fully apparent to the public, but one that contributes to the alleged panic behind the scenes. And the pattern emerges. Words that once seemed straightforward now suggest awareness, caution, and concern. Statements about family protection, media vigilance, and narrative control, repeated over years, align closely with what investigators allege are discrepancies in timing, hospital sightings, and selective image releases. The result is a portrait of a man who is simultaneously public-facing and deeply attuned to the consequences of any leak, misalignment, or misperception. Finally, commentators note the emotional impact on audiences. For those watching Harry's statements in isolation, they may appear composed, deliberate, and thoughtful. But when re-examined alongside timelines, photographs, and external commentary, they take on a new intensity, a tension that reflects not just personal experience, but a complex, ongoing negotiation between public expectation, private reality, and the pressures of exposure. And that is why re-examining Harry's own words is more than just analysis. It's a lens into a mind under pressure, a lens into a narrative that is carefully managed yet vulnerable, and a lens into a story where one small misstep, one overlooked statement, one unplanned image, one timing discrepancy could amplify anxiety into panic. But what came next would place Meghan's own media strategy under the microscope, revealing a level of narrative control and selective disclosure that some say explains why the story has remained so tightly contained until now. If Prince Harry's words reveal caution, Meghan Markle's actions reveal precision. Observers and commentators repeatedly note that she has a unique ability to control narratives, even in chaotic circumstances, and Lilibet's birth allegedly brought that skill into sharp focus. From timing announcements to selective image releases, from media interviews to social media posts, Meghan's media strategy has been scrutinized like never before. And according to insiders, it may be one of the reasons why the Sussexes have managed to maintain privacy in the midst of global curiosity. But also why speculation, timing discrepancies, and alleged panic have arisen. Let's start with the basics. In any public figure's life, timing is everything. A birth announcement, a photo release, or an interview can shape perception for weeks, months, even years. Observers argue that Meghan has consistently used timing strategically. Every social media post, every official statement, every media interaction appears carefully choreographed to maximize control while minimizing exposure. And in the case of Lilibet, analysts suggest that the cadence of announcements, combined with selective photograph releases, was designed not just for public optics, but to anticipate potential scrutiny from investigative authors like Tom Bower. Some commentators point to patterns in past behavior. Meghan has long demonstrated an acute awareness of media cycles, understanding when stories gain traction and how to preempt speculation. Interviews are scheduled when they can have maximum impact. Photographs are released selectively. Spontaneous appearances are avoided unless they serve a strategic purpose. And when unexpected leaks or sightings occur, statements are often crafted immediately to frame the narrative in her favor. Observers argue that this level of precision is not accidental. It is deliberate, informed, and highly effective. The hospital photographs discussed in the previous chapter are a perfect example. While some images allegedly leaked without intent, others appear to have been selectively shared or positioned to convey a specific narrative: intimacy, care, family cohesion. Commentators argue that this selective visibility demonstrates an understanding of how images influence perception, even when other elements, timing, access, and selective disclosure, remain opaque. Meghan's media strategy, analysts suggest, operates on multiple levels. First, there is proactive control, determining what is shared, when and how. Second, there is reactive management, responding to leaks, rumors, or unexpected scrutiny in ways that mitigate damage. Third, there is narrative shaping, framing the story to emphasize privacy, family security, and strategic autonomy. And in the case of Lilibet, all three levels allegedly intersected to create a carefully curated public image, one designed to protect the child, maintain privacy, and simultaneously manage public perception. Consider the interplay with Harry's statements. His words often emphasize caution, protection, and awareness of public scrutiny. Meghan's actions amplify, support, and sometimes preempt these narratives. Commentators highlight the synergy between the two. Harry expresses intent, Meghan executes strategy. The result is a highly controlled narrative environment where leaks, timing anomalies, or selective images become central points of tension, both for the public and, allegedly, for Harry himself. The strategy also involves the careful crafting of public appearances. Analysts note that Meghan rarely appears spontaneously at events where uncontrolled observation could occur. When she does, appearances are staged, rehearsed, and carefully documented. Photographs, whether official or leaked, are often framed to convey specific emotions or messages: calm, intimacy, reassurance. And in the context of a newborn, every gesture, holding a child, smiling, interacting with staff, becomes part of a calculated public narrative designed to maintain privacy while projecting familial warmth. Another facet of Meghan's strategy is narrative consistency. Across interviews, social media posts, and public statements, there is an overarching theme: family protection, narrative control, and measured disclosure. Observers argue that this consistency is intentional, creating a baseline narrative against which any deviations, such as leaked photos or timeline inconsistencies, stand out starkly. In other words, by establishing clear messaging, deviations become both noticeable and analyzable, feeding speculation while still providing a controlled frame of reference. Timing is also tactical. Analysts suggest that announcements, photo releases, and interviews are often scheduled to coincide with media cycles that maximize visibility while minimizing intrusion. The spacing of Lilibet's birth announcement, for example, allegedly corresponds with periods of lower media attention or strategically positioned releases to redirect focus. By doing so, Meghan's team may reduce the potential for uncontrolled scrutiny while maintaining public engagement. The strategy extends to controlling the narrative surrounding surrogacy, whether or not it is involved. By avoiding confirmation, Meghan preserves flexibility in messaging while protecting her child's privacy. Commentators argue that this deliberate ambiguity is a hallmark of her approach, controlling perception without revealing specifics, leaving observers curious but constrained.